Hi, dear AP Human Geography students. This is Dr. Carol Gillespie, and we're going to be talking about the Rostow's model, Rostow's stages of economic growth model. Now, this model is one of the linear economic models of historic economic growth. It was presented by American economist Walt Whitman Rostow in 1960 as an alternative view of Marxist interpretation of history. The basic assumption of Rostow's theory is that countries want to modernize and grow. And it is a linear model, being that you go from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 progressively. You do not jump from stage 1 to stage 3 or 4, what have you. So this is called a linear model. The stages that he sees necessary for economic development, according to the historic economic performance of developed countries, is stage 1, traditional society; stage 2, transitional society, preconditions for self-sustaining growth; stage 3 is takeoff, sort of like a rocket, where the economy is taking off. It's got all the preconditions set and it's taking off. The fourth stage is the drive to maturity, and the fifth stage is the stage of high mass consumption. Now, we're only going to cover the 5 stages today and talk to them in depth a little bit, because this also is a precursor or a prelude to economic geography, which we'll get into in future chapters. But for right now, we're talking about development. So here is another visual representation. We have the development going up on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis we have time. So it's a factor of time and development, and you can see it progresses from stage 1 through the second stage, third, fourth, and fifth. So as time goes on, hopefully the society or the country's economy will develop in a progressive way, in a linear fashion. Now, the first stage depicts the traditional society. Traditional societies are characterized by nature and the limits of technology. More than 3/4 of the labor force is occupied in agricultural activities. Low social mobility and great division of wealth and political power are the other main features of a traditional society. Wars and famines and epidemics like the plague caused the initially growing populations to stop growing or even shrink. And this limits the single greatest factor of production, which is human manual labor. Volume fluctuations in trade due to political instability are frequent. And so we see that historically, trading was subject to very, very great risk, and the transport of goods and raw materials was expensive, it was difficult, it was slow, and it was unreliable. The manufacturing sector and other sectors, other industries, tend to grow slowly, but they don't have enough scientific knowledge, and they don't have enough they have a very traditional, backward frame of mind that contributes to low labor productivity. In this stage, some regions are entirely self-sufficient in settled agricultural societies. Before the Industrial Revolution, a hierarchical social structure relied on near absolute reverence for tradition. Tradition governed, and they insisted on obedience and submission. This resulted in the concentration of political power in the hands of landowners in most cases. So family and lineage was very important. Marriage ties. This is back when you saw more of the marriage between families of wealthy landowners, and you would see that this was the primary social organization, along with religious customs. And the state or the federal government only rarely interacted with local populations and in just very limited circumstances. The social structure was considered feudalistic in nature, and under modern conditions, these characteristics have been modified by outside influences somewhat, but the least developed regions and societies fit this description pretty well. So, hence, you can see if you're taking notes in traditional society, the subsistence agriculture or hunting and gathering was almost wholly a primary sector economy. Limited technology, there was a very rigid, static society. There was lack of class mobility. You couldn't move from the lower class to the higher classes very easily. There was very little chance that you could also improve your mobility economically. If you were born into a very low class working home, then that's where you would probably make your living till you died. Stability was prioritized, and change was generally viewed negatively. And then we go into the second stage, which is the transitional stage. This, according to Rostow, was a precondition of takeoff. And it was characterized by political and social traditions and transitions from feudalism. So the stage between feudalism and takeoff is simply called the transitional stage. You're transitioning the economy from traditional into ready to take off. The main economic requirement in the transition phase is the level of investment, and it should be increased at least to 10% of national income to ensure self-sustaining growth. The main direction of investment is to develop the social and physical infrastructure, and this would be these are the main dimensions to this transition here. Firstly, the shift from an agrarian agricultural to an industrial or manufacturing society starts. It may start slowly, but it does start. Second, trade and other commercial activities of the nation broaden the market's reach, not only to neighboring areas, but also to far-flung areas and regions. So international markets are created. Third, the surplus should not be wasted on the conspicuous consumption of the landowners or the state, meaning the federal government, but should be spent on developing industries and infrastructure. Infrastructure like roads and bridges and communication systems, thereby preparing for a self-sustained growth of the economy later on. Fourth, lastly, agriculture becomes commercialized and mechanized via technological advancement, shifts increasingly towards cash or export-oriented crops, and there's a growth of agricultural entrepreneurship. The rise in investment rate depends on many sectors of the economy. Agriculture plays a very important role in this transition process, as the surplus quantity of produce is to be used to support an increasing, growing population of workers in the cities. And it also becomes a major exporting sector, earning foreign exchange for continued development and capital formation. Increases in agricultural productivity also lead to expansion of domestic markets for manufactured goods and processed commodities. And this adds to the growth of investment in the industrial sector. Now, social overhead capital creation. In Rostow's model, he said this could only be done by government. What do we mean by social overhead capital? Well, these are the things that the government must take care of and pay for in a advancing economy. Government plays the driving role in development of social overhead capital because it is rarely profitable. So you cannot get private investors to invest their money in it because it's not going to make them a profit. It usually has a long gestation period, which means that from the input of the money or capital into the program, it takes a pretty long time to see any fruits of it. And it is the benefits, the payoffs accrue to every economic sector, not just the one that's investing, the investing entity. So the private sector is not interested in playing a major role in the development of social overhead. On the social front, a new elite must emerge to construct the industrial society, and it must be given some authority of the land-based elites of the traditional society. Surplus must be channeled by the new elites from agriculture to industry. And the country would be able to achieve this following the requirements of this stage. So they will develop a social infrastructure, transportation, communication systems, irrigation systems. These all must be part of the social overhead that is developed during this stage 2. They must increase the food production enough to feed the population. This is a concern of usually the government and not an individual private sector or investor. And they must increase the imports while increasing capital goods and expanding entrepreneurial activities. All these changes prepare the way for takeoff. Only if there's a basic change in the attitude of society towards risk-taking, changes in working environment, and the openness to change itself in society and in political organizations and structures. The preconditions of takeoff closely track the historic changes and stages initially of the British Industrial Revolution. Now, stage 3 is takeoff. And the characteristics of takeoff are sometimes very similar to the stage of precondition to takeoff, the transitional stage. However, since the preconditions for the takeoff have been met in the transition stage, takeoff is a short stage of development that takes probably 2 decades, 20 years. Development becomes self-sustaining, and investment must not exceed 10% of national income. So it increases per capita income and level of investment. What is per capita income? It's the average income per person of everyone living in the country, in the economy. So the per capita income must be increased during this takeoff stage. So what we see, some characteristics of the takeoff stage 3 are, we see political and social institutions begin to develop, and the needed capital is mobilized from domestic resources and is steered into the economy and not into domestic or state consumption. We see cities grow and urbanization increases. We see agriculture assuming a lesser importance, and we see the development of one or more substantial manufacturing sectors occurring with a high rate of growth. We see industrialization becomes a crucial phenomenon, and as it helps to prepare the basic structure for structural changes on a massive scale. Now, Rostow says this transition does not follow a set trend, as there is a variety of different motivations or stimulus, which begins the growth process. Takeoff requires large and abundant loanable funds for expansion of the industrial sector. And these funds generally come from two places: increasing taxes, which we're all facing this coming year, and implementation of land reforms. Now, the Green Revolution is back here on this. An example of the takeoff phase is the Green Revolution of the 1960s. The Green Revolution is an example of the takeoff phase for countries like India and Pakistan, for example. It was a scientific and technological breakthrough. Scientists from all over the world got together and tried to develop a way to feed more people because the population was going up, and in the 1960s that was a major concern. We have people starving in various countries throughout the world, and we want to find a better way to feed these people. So they introduced high-yielding hybrid varieties of seeds. They introduced new fertilizers to grow them, and pesticides and insecticides to help them grow and to fight the factors that would keep them from growing. Irrigation systems and water. And this occurred in several countries. And in India, many modern farming methods were introduced. They developed the use of tractors and mechanized equipment for farms, pesticides, insecticides, fertilizers, irrigation facilities, and the use of a high-yield hybrid seed, hybrid corn and hybrid wheat, which are the two main grains used in India. The successes of the revolution created many more jobs and involved increased production of agricultural machinery. And it caused India to become self-sufficient in producing food grains. So they didn't have to keep importing rice and wheat any longer. And they actually made a surplus and were able to export the grains, increasing their national income. The takeoff needs one more important thing, and that is they need a group of entrepreneurs. Who are entrepreneurs? They are people willing to take a risk, to invest money into something, and maybe not make money, maybe go belly up, but they're a group of special people who will take that risk in society to pursue innovation and accelerate the rate of growth in the economy. So some examples of takeoff successes were grains in the USA and in Canada and Russia as well. Russia in the Ukraine region especially. The Ukraine was and probably still is the breadbasket of the former Soviet Socialist republics, the USSR, communist Russia, the communist Soviet Union. Timber was an example also of how takeoff occurred in the Swedish economy. Well, Rostow concluded that any industry can play the role of leading sector in the takeoff stage. But it has to meet, the industry has to meet, or the economy has to meet these three conditions. There has to be urbanization increases, there has to be industrialization, has to keep proceeding rapidly, and there has to be technological breakthroughs for it to occur and to be called takeoff. Now, stage 4, the drive to maturity. Rostow defines this as a period when a society has effectively applied the range of modern technology to the bulk of its resources. Now, regularly growing economy drives to extend modern technology. over the whole front of its economy, all its economic activity. About 20% of the national income will be steadily invested, and this will permit output to regularly outstrip the growth in population. The leading sectors will be determined by the nature of the resource endowments, natural resources, availability of skilled labor, and not just technology. So the economy matures as old industries go away and new industries emerge. Environmental and health costs of industrialization are recognized, and policy changes are made accordingly. The workforce composition in agriculture shifts from 75% of the working population to 20%. The workers acquire greater skills and their wages increase in real terms. The character of leadership changes significantly in the industries, and a high degree of professionalism is introduced. And the economy finds its place in the international economy. Goods formerly imported are now produced at home. New import requirements developed to curb import and protect the home industries, and new export commodities are created. So during this last stage, a country has to decide whether the industrial power and technology it has generated should be used for the welfare of its people or to gain supremacy over others, or maybe the world in total. Now, a case study, a prime example of a country in the drive to maturity stage is South Africa. South Africa is developing a world-class infrastructure, which includes a modern transportation network, widely available energy, and sophisticated telecom facilities. Additionally, the commercial farm sector has shed 140,000 jobs, a decline of roughly 20% in the 11-year period from 1988 to 1998. This diversity leads to reducing the poverty rate and increasing the standard of living for everyone, as a society no longer needs to sacrifice its comfort in order to build up certain sectors. There is a great diversification of the industrial base. Multiple industries expand, and new industries take root quickly. Manufacturing shifts from capital goods towards consumer durables and domestic consumption. There's a rapid development of transportation infrastructure and a large-scale investment in social infrastructure, schools, universities, and hospitals. This is all happening in stage 4. Stage 5, our final stage, is the stage of high mass consumption. And this refers to the period of contemporary comfort that we find in the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Germany, and in most Western nations, where consumers concentrate on durable goods and they hardly remember the subsistence concerns of previous stages. We find that we have basically an urban society. We have increased output levels. We have widespread consumption of high-value consumer goods. And we have consumers with disposable income. These are consumers with money to spend. And we find the stage of high mass consumption in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Singapore, I would say South Korea, Taiwan, We would find it in most European countries. Now, interestingly, Rostow uses the Budden Brooks dynamic metaphor to describe the change in attitude. Thomas Mann wrote Budden Brooks, a novel that chronicles the decline of a family over 3 generations. Thomas Mann wrote this in 1901. He was only 26 when he wrote this novel in Germany. He drew deeply on his own family history. His family was a mercantile or merchant class, upper middle class part of German society. And for this novel, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1929. Now, the story talks about, and here you can see the parallel to Rostow's model. The first generation of the Budden Brooks were interested in economic development. The second generation was interested in its position in society. And the third, already having money and prestige, concerns itself with the arts and music and become philanthropists and develop foundations to channel the vast wealth that they've accumulated in the 3 generations. They worried little about the previous earthly concerns. So too, in the age of high mass consumption, a society is able to choose between concentrating on military and security issues, keeping their borders safe and their people safe. They don't have to choose between equality and welfare issues or on developing great luxuries for the middle class. Each country can choose its own balance between these 3 goals. There's a desire to develop an egalitarian society, and they take measures to achieve this goal. According to Rostow, a country tries to determine its uniqueness, and the factors affecting this goal are political, and its geographical and cultural structure, and also values present in its society. Historically, the United States is said to have reached this stage first, followed by other Western European nations, and then Japan in the 1950s. And just a little, this will be the first part of a 2-part discussion of Rostow's model, because I've been going a little deeper into economic geography than I would if I was just talking about a model and then going on a model of development and then keep and just brushing through it. I want to you'll see a lot of these terms coming back up when we study economic geography soon. But I wanted to share, I had seen a documentary not long ago, a young man from what you would call the 3rd generation of elite families in this country, the United States. He did a documentary realizing his great privilege and being a member of the highest elites of the American society. His grandfather and grandfather's family had created a great source of wealth, and through investments they had just provided for future generations. This young man did not have to work. He went to college merely as something to do. It was done in his social class. He went to the very best private schools before he went to college. His family, his parents did not work. They dabbled in whatever interest they had. No one had to work, and no one will have to work in this elite status of our society. And he went and interviewed his friends who also came from families who were very, very in debt with money because of their grandparents. And he interviewed them, and he asked them what they wanted to do with their lives. And they really didn't have any big plans. Their families were concentrating on philanthropy. They headed foundations. They sat on boards of other families' foundations, and they decided how to distribute the money that they had accumulated through many generations of successful entrepreneurs. And it was just interesting. They really were good kids, but they didn't have direction and goals in their lives. And so they, other than summering in the Hamptons for, generations and doing that sort of thing, there was no drive to thrive because they already had those previous stages met. So it was an interesting comparison. Okay, stay tuned for the second part of this lecture, which we will concentrate in that on some of the flaws of the model, because there are flaws in this model. Every model has certain flaws, and we have to know what they are so we don't apply the model inappropriately. And we'll talk about the criticisms of the model and particularly the relevance of Rostow's theory to developing countries in our second series. Okay? So thank you for paying attention. Sorry this is so long. Take care. See you soon. Have a great week.